Hello, guys! Bom, essa é a aula que eu daria hoje, 16 de março de 2020. É uma revisão sobre as abordagens de ensino de inglês e eu vou explicar por que eu vou fazer essa revisão. Vocês já devem ter visto isso no ano passado, método de abordagens de ensino de inglês. Mas eu vou fazer uma revisão hoje, seguida de uma atividade, e vou explicar o motivo dessa revisão. Well, history of English teaching approaches from 1500s to today. 1500s because the first records of English or language teaching approaches date back to 1500s. Before that, there are no records in the literature about how people used to learn a language. Well, approaches are based on social historical moments defined by studies in interrelated areas that build their foundations. What does it mean? It means that there are many theories behind an approach that would lead the way we teach. So it means that concepts lead the way that teaching approaches are developed. Concepts such as what's language, how do people learn, how does the brain work, etc. So for example, let's compare communicative approach to, say, autolingualism approach. In the communicative approach, what is the concept of language? Language is communication, mistakes are part of the learning process, language input is necessary. So these are not techniques, they're just theories, theories that we find in the literature, of course. So the theories, they guide the way we behave in class. That's an approach. That's the meaning of approach as opposed to method. I'm going to talk about method a little bit later, okay? What about the theories behind the audiolingual approach? Language is habit formation because of behaviorism. I'm going to talk about that. Mistakes lead to wrong learning of language, so mistakes must be avoided. Repetition of correct full sentences is the key to learning a language. So all these theories, they guide the way we teach in class. So an approach is a set of theories that guide our behavior in class, the teacher's behavior in class. This is an approach. It's a set of theories. Theories that, of course, that we find in the literature. This is a figure that I found in Vilasa's paper. It's in the reference list. You can take a look later. So I'm going to describe the figure. There's a bubble with the word abordagem, approach, on the top, and then in the middle, method, and in the bottom, technique. That means that an approach is a set of theories, so it's something broader. That's why it's in the top. It's something bigger, it's something that involves method. And then method is the way we behave in class according to the theories that we are using. So if you're using the communicative theories, for example, the communicative approach as an approach, then we have some methods to follow. For example, one of the methods, we do not translate all the words because according to the theory behind the communicative approach, students need language input in English. So we do not translate every word. If you do not translate every word, this is a method. And then the theory behind that, the approach behind that, it is because students need language input. And the technique are the activities per se. So for example, if you use, let's say, a song to teach vocabulary or anything that you want to teach through a song, that's a technique. So that's the difference between approach, method, and technique. But this definition was discussed in the 1960s. So before that, a lot of, say, approaches were simply called methods. So I'm going to use here the way they were called in literature, okay? But you have to keep in mind when you say approaches and methods and also techniques, what scholars mean by approach, method, and technique. Well, the most prominent teaching methods that I'm going to talk about here are the grammar translation method, the direct method, the reading approach, autolingual approach, notional functional approach, communicative approach, and the post-method era, or also post-method approach. I'm gonna discuss each one of them. I'm gonna present each one of them. First, grammar translation method, according to the literature, it was a method practiced in the 1500s to the 1800s, but actually it's still in practice if you want to use grammar translation method. It doesn't mean that it ended in the 1800s and nowadays nobody uses it anymore. But what is the grammar translation method? It's the practice of translation of classical texts in Latin, explanation in a student's first language. I'm sorry guys, I just noticed that Latin is misspelled. It should be Latin as in Nancy, not M as in Mary, okay, but okay, typo, I'm sorry. Well, grammar translation method is a translation of texts to study, especially to study grammar, to study the structure of the language. And why it started around at 1500s, according to the first records of teaching methods, it's because in that time there were no scholars, linguists and people studying how to learn a language. So this is the only method they knew based on translation of classical texts. Because the Greek people the Roman people used to translate from Greek even centuries ago. So this was the only method they knew. There are no studies. There was no science based on what we do today, that linguists do today. Well, but even when French, Italian, and English, the modern languages, became important, this was the only method available because, again, there are no studies. And the concept of language behind it is the structuralistic approach, the structuralistic concept of language, which means that language is a set of structures. The focus was on form and not on meaning. Because there is this dichotomy of if you should focus on form or on meaning. What does that mean? Focus on form, for example, you could only explain grammar and forget about the meaning. There is a very good example that I read in a paper many years ago, but I can't remember the name of the author now. But the explanation for students to understand the difference between focus on form and focus on meaning is like this. Imagine the student comes to class and that student had missed yesterday's class, and then the teacher asked, "Why did you miss the last class?" And the student answers, "Oh, because my mom died." And then the teacher corrected, "My mom died." So this is totally focus on form, correcting the student's grammar mistake, not paying attention to the student's real problem, the meaning of what she said. Well, so the grammar translation method had mostly focus on form and not on meaning, because there were not many, linguistic studies, as we know today. Then the direct method was a response to the grammar translation method, because as I said, the grammar translation method started with translation of Latin texts, the classical Latin texts. But then, because there was this need of learning modern language because of world communication, even before the globalization as we know today, but there was this need of communication, and then the direct method was a response. Because there was a criticism saying that if you only translate, you're not speaking the language. You don't learn how to speak. You don't learn how to communicate with people. So in the mid 1800s, scholars started to study a new teaching method, and they developed a direct method. What is that? Communication opportunities among Europeans demanded a new method. I just mentioned that, right? And then scholars started to compare the way a child acquires her first language, and then the direct method was created. Something like this. If the child acquires a language by being exposed to this language and only by being exposed to the language all the time, and then what else? By not writing at first. So these are techniques or methods used for in the direct method, because as I said, it was called direct method because the difference between method approach came much later in the 1960s. But although it is called direct method, we could consider this an approach because the theories behind the direct method is the theories are related to the way a child learns. But it is called method because when it was created, there was no difference between method and approach. But as we understand approach today, we could call it approach, a direct approach, because all the theories that lead the way this method should be taught, all the theories are related to how a child learns a language. So anyway, in the literature, you'll find as direct method, not direct approach. But the theories are these: how a child learns. This is the first time the language scholars, the linguists, were systematically working on a method to teach English, to teach languages. Well, some methods inside the direct approach or direct method are that language had to be taught exclusively in L2, in the target language. Why? Because this is the way a child learns, right? The concept of language is still structuralistic, but with focus on meaning. The differences between learning L1 and learning L2 were not taken into account. Let me explain this. Guys, even today, there are many people that still say that we need to learn a language the way a child learns. That's not true. This is a theory that is like over 200 years old. So it cannot be right. Why not? Because the way a child learns, it's completely different from the way an adult learns a second language. When a child is learning a first language, first of all, that the child does not have another language to base on. The child does not have another language to compare. The child is not constituted by any language yet. But then when we are adults or even children or teenagers, learning a second language, we already have a first language to compare. We inevitably compare languages, and we are constituted as by our first language. So this second language, it's another identity that we are acquiring. It's a completely different cognitive process. So we cannot compare the way a child learns a first language and to the way an adult learns a second language. They're completely different processes. The way our brain works is different. We are acquiring, let's say, another identity. We already have a first language to base on, to compare, and to set our foot on, right? So this is a mistake to say that if you speak only English, let's say the second language, if you speak only English, this is the direct method. Well, the theories behind the direct method are a mistake, to base on the way that a child learns a language. And for example, in the direct method, students were not allowed to write in the beginning. Only after the students were able to speak, then they were allowed to write. Why? Because this is the way a child learns. The problem is that a child is not literate yet. That's why the child does not write. But an adult or even children or teenagers that are learning a second language or foreign language, they are literate. They already know how to write in their first language. So it doesn't make any sense to stop them from writing in the first months, let's say, of learning a language. So this is another method, not allowing students to write, that doesn't necessarily work because we are already literate. We want to write, we want to take notes sometimes. Some people, if they do not take notes, they don't learn vocabulary, for example. So the direct method was a response to the grammar translation method. I'm not saying that it did not work. Of course, many people learned by using this method, but it was created having in mind the theories that were available in that time. I'm talking about 19th century, right? So I'm talking about the theories that were available that time. The theories were that an adult could learn a second language the same way a child could learn a first language. However, nowadays we know that this process is different, that the brains work differently, okay? Well, the reading approach was a response to the direct method. It started in the early 1900s. Well, the direct method had a drawback. There weren't many teachers who were fluent in the second language, in the target language. So, of course, if there were teachers that were fluent, they could, of course, use the direct method at that time. But then there was another need, let's say, for the world. Not only oral communication, but written communication. People needed to read texts, so without the need of speaking. This is a specific situation. Sometimes there are a lot of situations where people have to know how to read and write in English, but not necessarily speak. So the reading approach was considered more useful for some contexts. That's why the reading approach was created, to meet the needs of some students, of some people in the world that needed to learn how to read and communicate in written documents. The concept of language in this case, for example, was language as a way to convey information. Because let's talk about a time where people could communicate to each other, but especially by writing, not necessarily, as we know, world communication today. Audiolingual approach was born during the Second World War. The American Army needed soldiers who could be fluent in L2, second language, in the shortest period of time as possible. They hired linguists to develop a teaching method for that. Audiolingualism is based on the psychology theories of those years, which is the behaviorism. So, in this case, there were scholars, linguists working to develop a method. They were hired specifically for that. And because they're scholars, they, of course, were using the theories that were prominent those times. And the behaviorism was that theory, okay? Let me explain what behaviorism is. It started with the psychologist Ivan Pavlov, 1849 and 1936, as a classical conditioning. I think you've heard about that. This is only a review, but anyway, he used to ring a bell whenever he was feeding a dog, and then he observed that the dog would drool every time he rang the bell. So the dog was conditioned to drooling because of the bell. So this is conditioning. You are conditioned to do something based on a kind of stimulus. This is a chart that let me explain this picture. There are two dogs talking, and then a bowl of dog food, and Pavlov writing in a notebook. And one of the dogs says, is talking to the other and says, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." So it's like the dog is studying Pavlov, that's Pavlov is conditioned to write when the dog drools. So it's like the opposite roles here. Then Skinner, which is like the father of behaviorism, used the ideas of Pavlov to develop his theories. He wrote a book called The Verbal Behavior. Skinner was a psychologist too, but he influenced language teaching because of this book, The Verbal Behavior. Well, according to behaviorism, all learning depends on conditioning and positive reinforcement. Conditioning is like you do something repetitively, like you repeat, and then you learn. And positive reinforcement, it's like this. If you do something right, you receive like a prize for that. It's like positive reinforcement. Or, it's like a reward, for example. Well, linguists used this idea that all learning depends on conditioning and developed a method totally based on repetition. As I said, neither Pavlov nor Skinner were concerned about the process of language learning, but because of their theories were prevalent in those times, the behaviorism, they influenced its studies on language teaching and learning. For the first time, a teaching approach was totally based on science. The direct method was also created by linguists, but they were using theories that were not considered science. But in this case, behaviorism was considered science in the 1940s. The concept of language behind this approach is that language is learned through conditioning, repetition. Then mistakes and errors must be eliminated from the process of learning because they lead to a bad behavior. So all these repetitions, they are based on a behaviorist idea that repetition leads to acquisition. Repetition of full sentences. Say, I drink water, and then everybody repeats, I drink water, and so on. But then, in the 70s, Chomsky criticized behaviorism. Because if you say that language is a habit formation, you're saying that it's the environment that influences the way we learn a language. But Chomsky said that it was genetics. So there was this huge discussion in the 70s between, is language learning genetics or influenced by environment? Nowadays, we understand that both influence language learning. Well, some criticism to behaviorism based on Chomsky. Language is genetics and not behaviorist. Human beings have a genetic capacity of learning a language, and behaviorism does not entail all complexity involved in the process of learning a second language. And then Chomsky's theories started to influence studies on language teaching and learning. Also, his concept of competence and performance. According to Chomsky, competence is the knowledge you have about a language, and performance is this knowledge being used. Chomsky was not concerned about learning a second language when he developed the competence and performance concepts, but then Delheims another scholar, Del Himes brought these concepts to the teaching of a second language. And then he says that competence is knowing the language. For example, if I can explain how English works, but for example, in Portuguese I can say, let's suppose, a terceira pessoa do singular a gente coloca S no presente, né? He loves e I love. I'm talking about the language, so this is competence. And then performance is this knowledge being used. So performance is using the language itself. This concept led the way we teach today, because if you're teaching a language, I'm sorry, if you're teaching a language and the way we teach leads the student to talk about the language, but not to speak the language, we are in the wrong way. So grammar translation method, if you use grammar translation method exclusively, that could lead to a student to speak about the language, but not to speak the language. That's the difference between competence and performance. That started with Chomsky, but it was brought to second language acquisition by Del Himes. Well, this led to a difference between knowing the L2 and knowing how to speak that L2. Well, this was the beginning of the notional functional approach in 1970s. Notional functional approach is based on the functions of language. How to. Well, if you pay attention to some materials, you can see that, for example, you have activities. How to buy clothes at a store. How to go to the movies. You know, so these how to, they're functions of the language. And then the idea of language as a social tool to communicate. And the syllabus is structured around how people really speak in real life. And this was the dawn of the communicative approach. Now, let's talk about the communicative approach. 1970s to today. To understand the communicative approach, we have to understand Krashen's influence on the communicative approach. Krashen wrote his books in the 1980s. And he wrote about the comprehensible input hypothesis, which states that the learning process occurs when a learner is exposed to a lot of comprehensible input by reading and listening. And also language production is necessary, speaking and writing, but language production occurs only after the exposure. The criticism against this idea is that nowadays it's widely known that language production, speaking and writing, is part of the learning process, not its product. So he was right when he said that the learner needs to be exposed. He was right about the input, but he was wrong by saying that we speak after the input. So we have to receive a lot of input, and then magically we start to speak. Nowadays we understand that we have to have input, but at the same time we need to practice the language. So language production has to occur at the same time as language input, not after it. So there is a criticism against his idea, but his idea is still used today as the input, the need for input. The monitor hypothesis. He says that consciously learned grammar rules function only as a monitor or editor. Learning the rules is not a prerequisite to language acquisition. It's like this, whenever the monitor hypothesis like this, whenever we're speaking, sometimes we just go back, we consciously go back to what we are saying to correct our mistakes. So for example, I may say, I love chocolate, but my daughter don't like it. Oh no, my daughter doesn't like it. So this going back to my daughter doesn't to correct my mistake, this is the monitor hypothesis. He also developed the affective filter hypothesis, which states that affective factors can play a debilitative role. So, for example, if your affective filter is high, it means that you are emotionally vulnerable, let's say, and then you don't learn very well. So it happens, for example, to shy students, to people who are anxious, and then they don't learn well because their affective filter is high. So according to Gresham, we should lower students' affective filter to make learning more effective. There's the learning acquisition hypothesis. Gresham differentiates between learning and acquisition. Learning is a conscious process, and acquisition is a subconscious process. But there is a criticism, because for Gresham, learning does not lead to acquisition, which scholars today do not believe to be true. What does that mean? It means that learning as a conscious process, for example, you get your notebook, you write sentences, you do grammar exercises, this is learning. And acquisition is implicit, subconscious, which means that when you're exposed to input and then you are learning not deliberately, and then this implicit learning would be the acquisition, the way that we acquire language. And learning would be only the way we explain about language. For example, when we consciously do exercises. So his theory is criticized because if you say that learning does not lead to acquisition, what's the point in doing exercises, right? So nowadays, these processes, they are called explicit and implicit learning. So explicit learning is like when you're consciously doing exercises, consciously studying. And implicit learning is just all the things we learned, but we don't know how. For example, I know many more words than the words that I studied, that I did exercises about these words, that I looked it up in a dictionary. No, I didn't look it up in a dictionary, all the words I know. So how do I know these words? I have no idea. So this is the implicit learning. We do not say learning and acquisition as different things, because then we are saying that Gresham was right, that learning does not lead to acquisition. But today scholars do not believe that. We just call it explicit and implicit learning. In sum, for communicative approach, language is real communication, so real situations must be role-playing class. For example, how to go through all the process in the airport, for example. Authentic texts must be used as opposed to artificial texts. So instead of just creating texts for students to read, but they're artificial, like created by the teacher. In communicative approach, scholars recommend that authentic texts are used, like real texts that were, say, published in, for example, newspapers and websites, of course. Mistakes are part of the process. Differently from the audiolingualism approach, mistakes are not a problem, just part of the process. So it's okay to make mistakes, and one day you're going to correct them according to your monitor hypothesis. Students need a lot of input, reading and listening, and output, speaking and writing. Input and output are also called reception and production. In the past, some years ago, it used to be passive and active language, but it's no longer called passive and active language because no language is passive. Like reading and listening are not passive. You are actively using your brain to understand the text, to interpret the text, oral text or written text. So nothing in language learning is passive. So instead of passive and active, we call reception and production, or input and output. And students' learning styles and emotional conditions, like affective filter, need to be taken into account. Guys, I've seen that there are some typos here that I'm going to correct before uploading these slides on Google Classroom, like need to be taken, not need to be taken into account. In the post-method era, 2000s, I mean today, although we still talk about the communicative approach, which is the most recent approach, scholars are also talking about the post-method era or post-method approach. What is that? The idea that there's no best method. Like, if I criticize autolingualism, does that mean that nobody in the 40s and 50s and 60s learned a foreign language? No, it doesn't mean that. I mean, a lot of people learned languages using other older methods and approaches, right? So there's no best method. Some people need translation to learn something, to learn vocabulary, for example. So students' needs must be taken into account, and teachers' approaches may change from class to meet such needs. So if you change your approach, it's a kind of mixture of approaches. But this mixture of approaches and methods needs clear criteria. It should not be a crazy, confusing type of mixing up. So you have to know what you're doing. If, for example, you're using some translation, not the grammar translation method, but translation as a technique, for example, one activity that people could translate inside inside a class with many other activities, and other activities are more related to the communicative approach, but there is one activity, one technique that's related to the grammar translation method, then that's kind of this post-method era. You are changing, you are mixing up approaches to attend students' needs. However, it's not only, as I said, it's not only mixing up things. You have to know why you are doing it. And why this review was important. Well, yeah, this is today, let's say today we are in this post-method era because we consider that nothing is prohibited. For example, if you have to speak a little bit of Portuguese, that's not prohibited. It depends on the student's profile. If you have to use translation sometimes, that's not prohibited. It depends on the the students' profiles. So nothing is prohibited, but you need to have theories. You need to know what you're doing, because you adapt your methods according to the student's needs. So this is the post-method approach or post-method era. You adapt your method to the student's needs, you adapt your techniques. Well, why is it important to review these approaches and methods of teaching? Because when you create a material, you elaborate a material, you need to know what you're doing. It's not only based on your beliefs. You need to know what's the theory behind of what you're doing. You need to understand, for example, that when you are repeating something, you are based on the behaviorist approach, behaviorist theory that influenced the autolingualism approach, saying that repetition leads to acquisition. So you need to know why you're doing that. In the communicative approach, repetition is still used. However, from repetition, you go to real communication. So you repeat to memorize, to learn a structure, to memorize words, and then you go to real communication. The problem of audiolingualism is that real communication didn't happen. It was like in the middle of the way. And then in the communicative approach, we go from repetition to communication. But repetition is still there, because repetition is not bad. I mean, it's still there, right? So you have to know what you're doing. If you're translating, for example, you can't simply say that, oh, translation doesn't work because because I heard that translation is terrible. Not necessarily. If you learn your students' needs, sometimes translating one or another word that's not the focus of the class, for example, or doing translation of small texts for some reason, you need to know the reason, then it's valid. So that's why we call this moment we're living the post-method era, although the communicative approach is still the most used, especially in language schools. Well, what you're gonna do now, there is an activity that I'd like you to do. I'll upload on Google Classroom, and you're gonna do some activities as though you were students, and then you're going to discuss what theories, what approaches are behind those activities. As I said, the importance of knowing all the approaches is knowing what you're doing when you create, when you elaborate material. It could be like a whole textbook or even extra material that you're elaborating for your students, but you have to know what you're doing. You have to know the theories behind what you're doing. Otherwise, you're not a teacher. It's just a tutor, okay? So guys, that's all for today, and I'm going to upload more classes if needed be. Let's wait to see when we're gonna go back to the classroom. If you have any questions, any comments, you can contact me, okay?